When Leona Kinsey went missing, separating fact from rumor proved difficult. But within a few years, one person of interest rose to the top of the list. But suspicion is not evidence, and the real answers to what happened and why are still just out of reach. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines and this day's episode of the 12 Days of Crimelines, where I do daily episodes as a thank you to my listeners for their support year-round. I do need to give some extra thank yous this week. One to Light the Way, because they connected me with the other person I need to thank, which is Carolyn DeFord. Light the Way is a victims advocacy group that works with a number of families of missing persons, and you've probably heard of some of them, like Oakley Carlson and Maura Murray. But they also are working on other cases like Teresa Corley and Victoria Raymond, and of course, this one, the disappearance of Leona Kinsey. And the family member of Leona's that they work with is Carolyn DeFord, her daughter. And so I was able to do an interview with Carolyn thanks to Light the Way connecting us, and I want to thank both of them for their help. Leona was an enrolled member of the Puyallup tribe, whose name for themselves is Puyallupopsh. And their ancestral lands are the foothills of the Tequotma, which you may know better as Mount Rainier. Leona was also Nisqually, but as we've talked about in other episodes, people can have claim to multiple tribes ancestrally speaking, but most tribes do not allow dual enrollment. Both the Puyallup and the Nisqually relied on local rivers for fish and also providing water for the many plants that grew in the area. After European contact, the Hudson Bay Company set up a trading post, and there was a period of peaceful coexistence. But as the indigenous people lived on quality land, non-native settlements started expanding until competition for resources caused issues. The Puyallup and their neighbors, including the Nisqually, were then invited to Medicine Creek on December 24, 1854 for a potlatch, which is a traditional gift-giving feast. Instead of gifts, the government representatives brought a treaty document. It would establish 3 reservations while giving over the resource-rich land to the U.S. government. Negotiations lasted 3 days, and in the end, a few tribal representatives signed their mark on the document. Now, that's the official story you might read in a textbook. The real story was that the tribal representatives who supposedly signed this document that was written entirely in English, none of them spoke English. And it's likely not all of the X marks were made of their own free will. To get the required representatives, it's believed that some were forced to sign it, and other marks may have been straight up forged. The treaty preserved fishing rights, but took almost all of the best farmland, particularly from the Nisqually. The 3 reservations established were away from the resources that the tribes had always had, and they were not large enough for the people the government tried to relocate there. This then led to what is known as the Treaty Wars that lasted from October 1855 until March of 1856. It's also called the Puget Sound War if you want to look up more details. The battles are described on Wikipedia as a series of short skirmishes, but that doesn't mean there weren't casualties. In late August 1856, the treaty was renegotiated, which gave more land to the tribes and established a 4th reservation. However, it fell far short of what the tribes were asking for, which was for their homes back. I've realized during researching this case and this history how many times I've talked about the relations between the U.S. government and the Native people in this time frame while using the word land. But that's the U.S. government's perspective. To the Puyallup, the Nisqually, and every other tribe being pushed out onto reservations, these were their homes. Their literal physical house was taken from them. 3 years into covering MMIW cases and tribal history, I'm still learning how influenced my language has been by what I was taught in school. The Native people were not forced off their vague lands, they were forced from their homes. The The Puyallup Reservation, as well as the Nisqually Reservation, is by Tacoma, and both tribes continue to fight for their rights, including fishing rights, land rights, and economic self-determination. Because of that, they continue to expand services and job opportunities on the reservation. If you've ever gotten an Amazon package that was sorted through Fife, Washington, you've seen this development in action, as that is located on the Puyallup Reservation. But it was before Amazon was profitable that our case takes place today. Today we're talking about Leona Kinsey, who was born December 15th, 1953. And if you think about the outdoors, you're thinking of Leona. She loved everything having to do with the land around her, and really, if you've been to the Pacific Northwest, you know that there's a lot to love. As a spiritual person, Leona felt connected to the earth and also the self-sufficiency the land provided. Carolyn told me growing up, the freezer was always stocked with meat that they had hunted and processed themselves, as well as things like huckleberries that Leona had foraged. With how much Leona loved the outdoors, it's not surprising that she was drawn to people who were like-minded. When she was in her late teens, she met Carolyn's father. Leona was living on the Nisqually Reservation at the time, which is near Tacoma. They were together for several years, separating around the time Carolyn was about a year and a half. A couple years later, Leona met Harvey. Carolyn has described both her father and her stepfather as very calm, patient people, which brought some balance to Leona, who was fiery and full of energy. Leona settled down with Carolyn and Harvey in La Grande, Oregon, which is in the northeast part of the state. Leona and Harvey enjoyed the outdoors together, but they also had a big social life, and that did include drinking. Eventually, for Leona at least, it started to include drug use. This was a factor in Leona and Harvey splitting up, though they stayed friendly enough that Harvey would even help with things like helping fix Leona's vehicle when needed. After Harvey left, it was just Carolyn and Leona, and in some ways they were very close, but in other ways there was tension. Leona very much wanted to be Carolyn's mom, the one who she could rely on. But too often, as happens with children whose parents are in active addiction, the child ends up feeling like they have to take care of their parents. One of the hardest moments for the two of them was after Leona was arrested when Carolyn was around 16. She had to serve about 6 months in lockup, and Carolyn was left largely on her own. Her stepfather checked in on her to make sure she had what she needed, but that didn't substitute the stability of having a parent in the home full-time. But that's not to say that Leona didn't try to get sober. She had a decent stretch after she went to rehab, where she wasn't using, but then she relapsed. She also had a court-ordered treatment after her arrest, and then other attempts to get sober on her own. But long-term recovery just stayed out of her reach. By 1999, Carolyn was grown and living with her own family in the Tacoma-Olympia area, while Leona was living in La Grande, where she had really put down roots. La Grande isn't a huge town, but Leona had a lot of friends, and she also had a lot of loyal clients for her business. She worked for herself cleaning houses and doing yard work, and Leona was not afraid of hard work. In spite of anything else going on in Leona's life, she always worked and always took care of her beloved pets, and she loved being a grandmother. But Carolyn understood that as much as it looked like Leona was holding it together from the outside, her chronic substance use was still a huge problem. As an adult living 5 hours away, Carolyn wrote Leona a letter that drew some hard boundaries. It was almost like an intervention by mail. She wrote that she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she didn't speak up and then something bad happened to Leona. Leona was on a dangerous path, and Carolyn wanted her to seek treatment to get off the drugs and be that strong Native grandmother she knew she could be. Until that happened, though, Carolyn did not see how Leona could be in her children's lives. Carolyn cried as she wrote this letter to her mother, and while we don't know Leona's reaction as a mother, I imagine she cried receiving it. But just because things hurt to say and may hurt to hear, it doesn't mean we shouldn't say them. This letter was sent not long before Leona disappeared. What we know is that on Monday, October 25th, 1999, Leona saw her friend Nancy in town and told her that she'd be by her house later in the evening. She had to meet with a man she called Mexican John at the Albertsons grocery store, and then she would be over to Nancy's house. But Leona never showed, and she never called. The next day, Nancy went out to Leona's house to check on her, and both Leona and her car were not there. Nancy saw that Leona's pets had been left unattended, with the dog locked in the kennel outside and the cat locked inside. This wasn't something Leona would have done. Her dog was an indoor dog who went everywhere with her. She didn't just leave the dog out in the kennel alone like that. Concerned, Nancy called Carolyn. The contact number she had for her was her workplace, so she left a message there saying that Leona was missing and she wondered if Carolyn had heard from her. Carolyn didn't work until the evening, but that whole day, nothing seemed to go right. It wasn't even that things were going wrong, it's just that Carolyn was just upset all day. Even trying to pick out something to wear made her cry. It was just one of those days, and she didn't know why. When she got to work, Carolyn's coworkers could see that she was upset, and they assumed, because they heard the message, that it was because Leona was missing. They told her they had her shift covered, don't worry about it, and she should just go home. But because Carolyn actually didn't know about the message yet, she was just trying to assure her coworkers that she was just having a bad day and everything would be fine. So that's when they told her about Nancy's call. They still encouraged Carolyn to go home, but she thought they were overreacting a tad. Leona was a free spirit. She was the type who would change plans at the last minute, especially if she got a call about something like a job. That's just the way it was. So when Carolyn called Nancy back, it sounded like Leona simply didn't come over when she said she would, which sometimes happened. Carolyn did try to call Leona and left her a message, as well as paged her, expecting to hear back before long. Regardless of whatever else was going on in their lives and their relationship, Leona always returned Carolyn's calls. By Wednesday evening, when Leona hadn't been heard from in 48 hours, Carolyn started to really worry and realized at that point, Leona hadn't just flaked out on a visit with a friend. The next day, Thursday, was when Leona's case file starts, with Leona being officially reported missing. Her friend Nancy told the police what she had told Carolyn about Leona, saying that she was going to come over but then never showing up. Nancy said she spent the next 2 days driving around La Grande looking for Leona and/or her car and couldn't find either. An officer agreed to meet Nancy at Leona's house to see what was going on. While there, Nancy was able to find a window to crawl through, and she went inside. The home was mostly tidy, the way Leona kept it, and the only odd thing was what was left behind. Leona and her car were gone, but her purse, cigarettes, and pager were inside. Those were things she would have taken with her if she left for any length of time. Nancy mentioned to the police that Leona did have an issue with a man named Mike over a car, and Nancy believed Mike had made some threats against Leona. According to the Oregon courts, Leona had filed a small claims court suit against Mike just a month before she disappeared, and it was still pending at the time. The police would hear about Mike from others, and they did talk to him. He confirmed that there was an issue between them, but he said he didn't know where Leona was, and he hadn't heard from her. Later on the same Thursday Leona was initially reported missing, Nancy called the police again and said she saw Leona's car. It was parked at the Albertsons parking lot in La Grande. Nancy first waited at the car thinking Leona was going to just come walking up, but when she didn't, Nancy called it in. This Albertsons was where Leona said she was going on Monday, so people had already checked that parking lot for her car and it wasn't there. When the police asked the employees at Albertsons, it was confirmed that the car had not been there the day before and was likely parked on the day it was found. So Leona disappeared on Monday evening, but her car didn't show up until Thursday. The car was found locked and was towed to impound to be searched. If anything of note was found, it has not been made public. The only thing was that the four-wheel drive, which had recently been repaired, was again broken. Another person who reached out to the police regarding Leona's disappearance was Lonnie, who was Leona's on-again, off-again boyfriend for about the last year and a half. It looks like from the case file, he first spoke to them 4 days after Nancy did. Lonnie said he saw Leona on Sunday, October 24th, but the two had an argument because Leona suspected he was cheating. Lonnie went to her house on Monday to talk to her about it and saw that the dog was out in the kennel with a big pile of food. He thought it looked to be about 3 days worth, but it wasn't normal for Leona to do this. If she was going out of town, she would either have taken the dog with her or she would have had someone watch the dog. She didn't just overload the food bowl and leave. Lonnie also said that he went inside and saw Leona's purse there. She didn't have cash in there, but she had a number of checks from clients dated October 16th, 21st, 22nd, and 24th. Again, if Leona was going out of town, she would have taken her purse with her or, at the very least, cashed the checks. Lonnie did turn the purse over to the police and said he was spending the night at Leona's so that no one would break in. Lonnie was asked what he thought happened. He said he first thought maybe Leona left town to get back at him for the argument, and he wouldn't be surprised if she was either staying with Nancy or Nancy knew where she was and was covering for her. But he didn't have any evidence that that was happening.
Determination comes in many forms, but always starts with a Dunkin' Run. So take your medium or larger coffee in one hand and grab a $1 donut in the other. No matter how you run, Dunkin' Run. A $1 donut with any medium or larger coffee. Excludes specialty donuts and fancies. Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer. Terms apply.
Spin your passion into a business with Shopify and break sales records with the world's best converting checkout. Let's hear that one more time. The world's best converting checkout. Shopify's legendary checkout makes it easier for customers to shop on your website, across social media, and everywhere in between. Now that's music to your ears. Any way you spin it, you can be a smash hit with Shopify. Start your $1 a month trial today at shopify.com/records.
From her home 5 hours away, Carolyn was trying to stay up to date on the investigation, but it would be about a week and a half before she could get to LeGrand. She had young children and she had to work. Leaving town for a 10-hour round trip and missing multiple days of work without notice was not something she could just do as much as she wanted to. And when Carolyn was able to get to LeGrand, she didn't have the time to focus solely on searching for her mom and meeting with the police. Leona had gone missing towards the end of October, and the landlord was very soon demanding November's rent. So when Carolyn did get out to LeGrand, she had to spend time packing up all of Leona's things and figure out where to store them. It had to have been surreal walking into Leona's home. There was fruit in the kitchen that had started going bad, a pot of coffee was just sitting there, and Leona's shoes were on the floor near the couch. It looked like she had just stood up, walked out, and they were just waiting on her to come back. As the family gathered to sort through Leona's things and decide what to do with them, Carolyn had the thought of, what if her mom just walked in and all of these people were rifling through her belongings? But they had no choice. As much as no one was ready to invade Leona's space and pack up her life, there wasn't time to do anything else. There were a number of early leads in the case, and one tip is something I want to talk about. A woman named Tracy called the police and said she was driving to work and saw Leona driving her car on November 3rd. She was sure it was Leona, but she didn't think much of it because she didn't hear that Leona was missing until the following day, so that's when she reached out to the police. This tip seemed very odd because Leona's car had been impounded by the police by that point. And if Leona was driving around town, surely someone would have had contact with her. But then the police noticed that Leona and her friend Nancy actually resembled each other, especially when Nancy wore her glasses while driving. Nancy also drove a similar car as Leona, and it's believed that Tracy had actually seen Nancy, not Leona. And the reason I bring this tip up is to illustrate the false sightings that come in during investigations. even from people who knew the missing person. We do have to take them with a grain of salt, but they also have to be fully vetted. We would be reporting this case as a friend saw Leona driving to this day if it hadn't been followed up on and ruled out. On December 8th, Nancy went back to the station to talk to the police again. Leona had been missing for 6 weeks without any trace of her. In Nancy's new statement, she said that she may have downplayed how deeply Leona was involved in drugs. This is not uncommon. When your loved one is missing and you're worried that the police won't look for them if they know that they use or sell drugs, you'd downplay it too. Nancy said that there was meth in Leona's purse when she saw it in the house, but then the drugs were not there when Lonnie turned the purse over to the police. Nancy believed that Lonnie had taken the drugs before turning the bag over. Nancy then explained that Leona usually bought her drugs from a man named John who had lived at Leona's house for a while. John's real name is Juan Peña Llamas, though he has a number of aliases, and Leona and Nancy mostly just called him Mexican John. After John moved away from La Grande several months before Leona's disappearance, he would come to town periodically and meet Leona at the Albertsons parking lot to supply her with drugs. Since she was headed there the evening she disappeared, she was very likely meeting him. That would lead to some speculation that whatever happened must have started in that parking lot. But because of the things that Leona left behind at her house, it seems that she likely went missing from there. So either she went to the Albertsons and then home, or she never made it to the Albertsons at all. The police heard John's name again a month and a half later when they talked to another friend of Leona's. He mentioned John Peña and said he had not seen John around since the time Leona was reported missing. He also said that John and Leona had issues in the past. He was aware of an incident where John trashed the house because Leona wouldn't sleep with him. Hearing John's name again made the police circle back to Nancy, and she added that there was a rumor that John was connected with the Mexican mafia. She too had not seen him around since Leona disappeared. From the case files Light the Way sent over to me, it looks like John was definitely on their radar, but so was the boyfriend, Lonnie. Towards the end of February 2000, 4 months after Leona disappeared, the police spoke to Lonnie again at the station. He denied knowing anything about her disappearance and said that his relationship with Leona was on the decline, so they hadn't really seen a lot of each other in the 3 weeks leading up to her disappearance. Asked who he thought might be involved, Lonnie said he still suspected Nancy because she seemed to take a special interest in knowing where Leona's purse was. And this is where Lonnie admitted that there had been meth in the purse, like Nancy said, about $1,000 worth, and he hadn't turned it over. He said he kept it and used it himself. Lonnie was asked if he knew John or Juan Peña, and he said he did. He said Leona usually met him in the Albertsons parking lot, which backed up what the police had already heard. It's noted at the bottom of this report that the follow-up was to attempt to locate John Peña. In the meantime, Lonnie and Nancy both took polygraphs, and according to the file, they both passed. Polygraphs are so dependent on conditions and the skill of the person administering it that I would want a deeper look into what was asked and if Lonnie and Nancy were sober or in recovery at the time of the tests. But even under the best condition, the accuracy of polygraphs is questionable. The one thing they're good for, in my view, is to put pressure on witnesses and suspects to tell the truth. As far as I can tell from the files, the police were unable to speak with John Peña until November 7th, 2001, 2 years after Leona went missing. He had been arrested on unrelated charges, so they interviewed him in lockup. John was willing to talk to them. He said that he and his ex Deanne lived in the house on the property where Leona lived, but Leona lived in the trailer. They were there for about 3 months before they left and moved out of the area entirely. He said he noticed that Leona used meth and had a lot of traffic to her door, but he denied that he was her supplier. John said that he and Leona were actually pretty good friends and they parted on good terms. He did hear that Leona was missing when he visited La Grande one day, but he didn't know anything about it. The police then reached out to Deanne, John's ex, to back up his statements. Now, let's just say there was not a lot of love lost between her and John. She called him a con man who stole credit cards and sold drugs. She said the first time she learned Leona was missing, she did talk to John about it, and while he didn't incriminate himself, she walked away with the impression he was involved somehow. Over the next several months, he would say things that were outright suspicious. Like one time, he said with confidence that no one will ever find Leona. And another time, after Deanne asked if Leona had been found, he said nope, but in a smug way, like he got away with something. And then he made a comment that if someone wanted to get rid of Leona, they would have killed her and dumped her body in a lake that she used to visit. No one would be able to find her for years. Unfortunately, Deanne couldn't remember what lake he said. The police then re-interviewed John just 2 days after the first interview, and they asked when he saw Leona last. And he said it hadn't been since he moved away from LeGrand. The investigators told him that they knew that was a lie, as several people had mentioned that he was meeting Leona regularly at the Albertsons parking lot for drug deals. He said not only was that not true, he was not involved in drugs at all. He admitted he did know a lot of people in the drug scene in the LeGrand area, but he was not one of them. Apparently, according to John Pena, everybody else was lying. Obviously, the investigators did not believe him, so the detective told John that they had no interest in drug charges at that point. They were only there to investigate Leona's disappearance. The hope was that if John was holding something back because he didn't want to face charges with regards to the drugs, he would open up when he knew they weren't an issue. But John insisted he was being honest. He hadn't seen Leona in months, and he never met her in the Albertsons parking lot or anywhere else to sell her drugs. He agreed to take a polygraph to prove he was telling the truth. The polygraph was scheduled for early December, and John, who had been released from lockup by that point, didn't show. More tips came in over the years implicating John Pena, including people who heard him confess to putting a hit out on Leona and saying her body was somewhere she would never be found. And the tips gave a possible motive, which had been a rumor swirling around town in the years after Leona's disappearance. According to a tipster, John said that he killed Leona because she was going to rat on him. Apparently, he thought she turned police informant. This is a tricky spot in retelling this case because police informants are obviously kept hush-hush, so we have to rely on what people heard or saw. One story going around was that the cops had pulled Leona in to approach her about being an informant days before she went missing, but she turned them down. If this did happen, she may have told someone about it, and maybe that someone told someone else, who then thought Leona may change her mind. Carolyn had also heard that her mother had been arrested, but the charges were dropped, maybe giving some legs to the idea that she had turned informant. I looked it up, and she did have a felony possession charge in 1995, and in October of 96, the charge was outright dismissed by the judge. I can't see everything online in regards to that charge, but according to the docket record, there was a motion to suppress from the defense that went to a hearing. The state opposed the motion, but the judge granted it. The odds are that the case was dismissed because whatever evidence was suppressed was necessary to support a conviction. However, it's possible that people heard Leona had been arrested and then got the charges dropped. And over time, people just started filling in the blanks with the idea that she had turned informant in order to get out of trouble. So basically, there doesn't have to be truth to the idea that Leona was a police informant for there to have been a rumor going around and people believing it. After this, years went by without much movement in the case. Depending on the investigator assigned at the time, Leona's daughter Carolyn would sometimes get updates and sometimes she wouldn't. In July of 2007, Carolyn got a private message on MySpace. She had posted about her mother's disappearance, and someone named Jerry, who used to live in LeGrand, reached out. He told her that his Uncle Tim had dated Leona around the time she disappeared. Rumors had been in the family for the last 7 years that Tim may have had something to do with her disappearance. According to the family story, Tim left home the evening Leona went missing, saying he was just going to run to the Albertsons real quickly. And then he was gone for hours. When Tim got back, he said he met someone and had to take care of something. Carolyn reached out to the police about this tip, and they downloaded her messages with Jerry and then reached out to Tim. They ended up speaking to him in mid-August 2007. He said he wasn't dating Leona at the time she went missing, but rather they had broken up 2 years before. However, the breakup was not on good terms. Like everyone else in town, it seemed he had heard rumors about what had happened to Leona. One thing he heard came from Leona's friend Nancy. Nancy said to him something about someone being dumped in the well on Owsley Canyon Road. So Tim went out there to look, but he didn't see anything. The detective noted in his report that Tim seemed genuinely concerned for Leona, and it doesn't seem like Tim was considered a serious person of interest in the case. 11 months later, in July of 2008, a cold case team interviewed Lonnie again. Lonnie brought up John Pena once again, saying that Leona used both John and another supplier to get her drugs, but the other person would only take cash. John would let Leona buy on credit. He heard through the grapevine that Leona owed John a considerable amount of money at the time she went missing. This stood out to me when I read it because John's ex had previously told the police that John was always clear that he would kill anyone, man or woman, who owed him money. Of course, it's not like we have John's bookkeeping to confirm or refute any debts owed to him, but it is another piece to a possible motive. Lonnie then shared a story with the police that was odd. He first had to back up and admit that he didn't use the $1,000 worth of meth himself that he had taken from Leona's purse, but rather he sold it. For obvious reasons, he didn't want to confess that crime to the police at the time. Lonnie said he was getting a lot of calls from people in the days after Leona disappeared, saying that Leona owed them money, and he got nervous about having the cash from the drug sales on him. So he put the money and Leona's weed pipe in a box and buried it in his backyard. While he was doing this, he noticed a car with tinted windows and California plates parked near his house. Lonnie said he approached the car after he buried the items, but because of the heavy tint on the windows, he could not see inside. A few days later, Lonnie noticed someone had dug up the box. 2 months later, the marijuana pipe showed up in his mailbox. This story is one of those things that seems to make so little sense that you're trying to figure out what its purpose is. If it's not true, why is Lonnie telling it? And if it is true, how does it fit into the bigger picture, particularly the person's decision to return Leona's pipe? It's one of those stories that leaves us with more questions than answers. Lonnie also told the police that he had gone to the Albertsons earlier in the day that Leona's car was found, and he hadn't seen it there, which gives more credence to the idea that it was dumped there by someone else. It's really too bad no one saw who it was. A bit over a year later, in September of 2009, the police questioned another ex of John Pena's, and this was Emily, his ex-wife. They had been together since the early 1980s, but they didn't get married until 91, and then they divorced in 1993. Their relationship, before and after the wedding, was on again, off again. And then after their divorce, they stayed in sporadic contact, and John would sometimes come visit her. He went there to see her in 2003, shortly before he went to prison on charges unrelated to Leona's disappearance. He told Emily that he had done away with Leona. She said she did not want to hear that and asked why he was telling her. He kept going and said that he and another man took Leona up a little road behind the Minum store, which is in Minum, Oregon, and they killed her. John said the other man actually killed her because he wasn't stupid and wouldn't do it himself. He did not say how Leona was killed or where her body was. Emily said she didn't really believe him at first because he lied a lot and said things for shock value. But then she heard he was actually a person of interest in the case and thought maybe he was telling the truth. John then went to prison, and Emily moved before he got out in 2006 because she was afraid of him. She heard he was going to be deported to his native Mexico, but he said previously that if he ever got deported, he would just come back to the U.S. anyway. She moved because she didn't want him to be able to find her. Based on Emily's tip, a short search was conducted of the area around the Minum store. They used 3 trained cadaver dogs. All 3 dogs alerted on the same 3 spots, and they were excavated with no obvious signs of human remains. Because the dogs all alerted on the same spots, they did believe there were definitely human remains there, but noted that all 3 areas also had a molehill nearby. They said if the moles took a piece of human remains, like a bone, down into their tunnels, that would cause the dogs to alert. So then that leads to the question, how did the moles get human remains to pull down into their tunnels? Though there isn't much in Minum now, there used to be. So it's possible due to the indigenous and settler history of the area that the moles found and disturbed an old grave. The dogs did not lead the searchers to remains anywhere else in the area, and the search ended around 2 p.m. that day. I think this would be an area that could use another search, honestly, given that the dogs were alerting near molehills. Finding the source might mean going farther out from that spot with the dogs, and possibly for more than just a few hours on one day. There was later a search of a pond in the area. The water was only 3 feet deep at most, so they were able to search using rakes and hands, but nothing was found. Another tip John's ex Emily gave was about something that happened on her family property in California. The two had been camping there for a bit before they moved to Oregon. One day after they left, Emily got a nervous call from one of her cousins. She and some other family members were worried that Emily was dead because they found a lot of blood in the outhouse on the property. The reason they were worried for Emily was that they also saw cucumber peels around. John was known for snacking on cucumbers, using his pocket knife to peel them as he ate. So they were afraid that John had hurt her. There was also some talk about there being a hole nearby with a bad odor coming from it. The police reached out to Emily's family to confirm, and her cousin said this did happen. She said she did want to figure out what was going on with the outhouse and that hole, but others in the family told her not to get involved. They were all too afraid of John, and the outhouse was torn down. There seems to be a difference in memories as to when this happened, with Emily's timeline putting it in the early 90s, but the cousin placing it as happening about a decade later. But what's relevant for the case we're discussing today is that neither put it at the time Leona went missing. Since it didn't seem connected to Leona, the police handed it over to the county sheriff out there. Hearing that Emily's family was afraid of John wasn't surprising to the police. Tips that both Carolyn and the police got echoed that, and for good reason. John had a violent criminal record. Carolyn had heard from an elderly woman who hired him as a farmhand that he assaulted, sexually and physically, her granddaughter. When she confronted him, he told her, quote, "I'll do you like I did Leona." This woman grew so fearful of John that she worried about retaliation if she tried to fire him. So she made an excuse claiming she couldn't afford to pay him and keep food on the table. She wanted him to leave without conflict. But that was not going to happen. John went out onto her property and killed a deer, telling her now she could feed her family and keep paying him. This was another intimidation tactic to scare her into keeping him there. But she was able to turn it around by filing a report with the police, and he was arrested for poaching the deer. This woman told Carolyn that she saw an article about Leona and wanted to reach out. She said John had even driven her past Leona's house one day and pointed it out. So Carolyn asked her where he took her. Now, the woman didn't just rattle off the address, which she could have looked up or found in the newspaper, but rather gave specific details about where it was and the landmarks around it, accurate details that backed up her story. While rumors have persisted around LeGrand about everyone we've talked about, especially Lonnie and John Pena, Pena seems to be the top person of interest. Because he was deported to Mexico, the police can't just bring him in for more questioning. The next chance they'd have to really talk to him would be if he returned to the U.S. or if they had enough evidence to arrest him in Mexico. With how much we know John has shared with people over the years, if he did kill Leona, there are likely people who know more, like where her body is, who just haven't come forward. Whether it's out of loyalty to John or, much more likely, fear, they've kept quiet, but it's been 24 years. People need to have loyalty to themselves and their own integrity and come forward. If you know anything about the disappearance of Leona Kinsey, please call the LeGrand Police Department at 541-963-1017 or reach out to the Finding Leona Kinsey Facebook group, and I'll leave this information in the show notes.